On the 5th of January 1942, as exultant shouts of victory resounded through the very streets of Tokyo, shaking the ancient city with a fever of triumph, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, aboard his mighty flagship Yamato, far from the jubilant capital, issued a quiet, grave command to the staff of the Imperial Combined Fleet. He instructed them to begin, without delay, the meticulous preparation for the second stage of operations in the Pacific War. His study of the situation reports flooding in from the Philippines, from Malaya, and from all points south, painted a picture of astonishing, almost dreamlike success. Japanese troops, he saw, would, within a few short months, stand in unchallenged control of virtually all of East Asia and the sprawling southern territories they had so audaciously attacked in December. Confident in this assessment, Yamamoto turned to his chief of staff, the loyal Admiral Matomi Ugaki, and delivered his directive. He wanted these new, far-reaching plans completed, polished, and ready for his review by the middle of February. The speed, the breathtaking velocity, with which the Japanese war machine had conquered the Western Pacific, had not only astounded the meticulous planners huddled in their Tokyo offices, but had also ignited a sharp, dangerous disagreement within the very heart of the Imperial General Staff. One faction, composed of ardent, almost fanatical military nationalists, their eyes gleaming with visions of an eternal, expanding empire, clamored to press on. They argued that as long as Japan tasted victory, as long as the rising sun flag flew over new territories, they must continue their relentless advance, no matter how far afield, no matter the cost, no matter the exhaustion of their men or the stretching of their supply lines to the breaking point. To halt, they believed, was to invite defeat. Such aggressive, almost reckless planning, however, stood in stark, silent opposition to another group, a group whose most prominent and powerful voice was none other than Admiral Yamamoto himself. He, and those who thought like him, had been less than enthusiastic, to put it mildly, about the fateful decision to open war with the United States and Great Britain. Even now, as the nation celebrated, Yamamoto worried, deeply and constantly, about the ominous, gathering clouds on the future's horizon. One compelling reason Yamamoto chose to remain at sea, aboard the floating fortress that was the Yamato, was a piece of grim advice from trusted friends within the Imperial General Staff. They had warned him in hushed, serious tones that if he remained in Tokyo, exposed and vulnerable, he would almost certainly be assassinated. His public, vocal opposition to a war of unlimited scope and duration, a war he believed Japan could not ultimately win, had made him a target for the very extremists now riding the wave of early success. Even now, surrounded by the steel and the disciplined silence of his flagship, his critical opinions were no secret to those who served closest to him. His chief of staff, Admiral Ugaki, confided in the pages of his private diary, writing of the desperate, urgent need for far-sighted statesmanship to follow this first glorious month of victory. These were not Ugaki's words alone. They were words Yamamoto himself used over and over, like a grim mantra, in his private warnings to his staff and to any political leader who would listen. He warned them with the weary certainty of a man who had seen too much, that Japan simply could not wage a prolonged, grinding war against the industrial and demographic colossus that was the Western powers, and hope, in the end, to emerge victorious. Yamamoto's sharpest, most open criticism was reserved not for his fellow officers, but for the politicians, the men in Tokyo who had steered the nation into this perilous conflict. He aimed his barbs particularly at Prince Kono and others in the government who, in his view, seemed utterly bewildered, lacking any coherent, realistic strategy for what sort of war Japan should actually wage in the vast expanse of the Pacific. He had tried in vain to make them understand. 3 months before the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had met with an old friend, Ryoichi Sasakawa, the powerful president of the ultra-nationalist Kokusui-do organization. They met at the Imperial Navy Club in Shiba, a place of quiet wood and whispered conversations. Yamamoto, ever the realist, warned his friend that war was now inevitable, a terrible machine set in motion by the decisions of politicians who did not grasp its full horrifying weight. He painted a picture of the immediate future. At first, he said, his voice low and grave. "We'll have everything our own way," stretching out like an octopus spreading its tentacles. And now, just a single month after the war drums had begun to beat, that octopus was indeed spread almost flat across the map, its limbs reaching from the snows of Manchuria to the tropics of the Dutch East Indies. Yamamoto, however, had also issued a chilling caveat to his old friend, Sasakawa. He warned him, with the clarity of a prophet, that this intoxicating euphoria, this national high, could not, would not, last. He pinpointed a moment, a specific, crucial juncture for political action, the moment that Singapore, the great British bastion, fell. That disaster, he predicted with uncanny accuracy, would deeply unsettle the British in India, shaking the very foundations of their colonial rule. They would, he was certain, be rendered desperate, willing, perhaps even eager, to listen to talk of peace, to seek a negotiated settlement before their empire crumbled entirely. Yamamoto knew the British, understood their character and their strategic thinking, because he had walked among them as a member of the Japanese delegations to the London naval conferences of 1930 and 1934. He knew the Americans even better, having served as the Japanese naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928. He had lived among them, studied them, and come to respect their resilience and their vast untapped industrial power. He agreed, reluctantly, that once the politicians had started the war, Japan had no choice but to fight for a major, decisive victory and to win it quickly, before the sleeping giant could fully awaken. But he also believed, with a conviction that bordered on despair, that once that initial stunning victory was achieved, Japan would have only a narrow, vanishingly small window of time, a year and a half, perhaps no more, to bask in its fleeting glory. "We must get a peace agreement by then," he had told Sasakawa with intense urgency, looking to his well-connected friend to carry this dire message, this plea for sanity, among the right-wing political leaders who now held the reins of power. On that January 5th, as Yamamoto gave his orders, that moment of victory, that moment for peace, seemed agonizingly close at hand. The American battleship fleet had been shattered, put out of action at Pearl Harbor on December 7th. The mighty British battleships Repulse and Prince of Wales had been sent to the bottom off the Malay coast. In the Philippines, Manila and the vital U.S. naval base at Cavite had been captured. The British had surrendered, humiliated, at Hong Kong. Japanese forces were surging forward, preparing for new landings in the resource-rich Dutch East Indies, at Rabaul on New Britain, at Cavite on New Ireland, and in the scattered, strategically vital Solomon Islands. The attack at Pearl Harbor, however, had not accomplished everything Yamamoto had fervently hoped for. The destruction of the major elements of the United States Pacific Fleet had been spectacular, yes, but incomplete. The American aircraft carriers, the new queens of the sea, had been providentially at sea during the attack and were thus untouched, unharmed. They represented to Yamamoto's keen strategic mind a constant gnawing threat, a sword of Damocles hanging over all his future operations. What was needed now, he knew, was not just another victory, but a truly spectacular war-altering achievement, a blow so devastating it would break the American will to fight. Yamamoto did not expect the fall of Singapore, his chosen moment for peace talks, to occur for another 5 or 6 months. It came astonishingly on February 15th, far sooner than even he had dared hope. Yet, even this stunning success did not alter his fundamental belief that if he was to achieve his overarching goal of setting the stage for meaningful negotiations, he must move, and move decisively, in another direction. The critical question now confronting his planners, huddled over their charts in the Yamato's war room, was brutally simple: where to strike next. The Imperial Japanese Army, ever protective of its domain and its resources, swiftly vetoed Yamamoto's bold, almost fantastical suggestion for an attack on the Soviet Union. Such a war, they argued, would be fought almost entirely on land, a domain where the army reigned supreme, and they were already heavily, dangerously overextended, bogged down in the vast, bloody quagmire of China and the sprawling campaigns across Southeast Asia. With that door firmly closed, Three other strategic ideas were laid on the table. Yamamoto's personal favorite, the plan that set his strategic mind alight, was a bold thrust into the Indian Ocean. The plan called for an invasion of Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, designed to draw out the British Eastern Fleet into a decisive, annihilating battle, mirroring his triumph at Pearl Harbor. After destroying the British fleet, Japanese forces would then push westward into the Middle East, aiming to link up with their Axis partner, Nazi Germany, who were driving relentlessly toward the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus. This grand, almost operatic strategy would not only deliver a crushing blow to British imperial power, but would also assure the Japanese Navy of all the oil it would ever need, securing its lifeline for decades to come. The Army, however, refused even to consider such a far-flung, logistically nightmarish operation in the Middle East. Their focus remained fixed on consolidating their gains in Asia. So only two plans remained on the table. One, championed by the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, called for a direct, massive attack on Australia itself. The logic was cold and strategic. Deprive the Americans of their most vital forward base of operations in the South Pacific. The plan envisioned a step-by-step advance. After securing the Solomon Islands, the Navy would seize New Guinea, then leapfrog to New Caledonia, Fiji, and finally Samoa, cutting Australia off from American support and leaving it isolated and vulnerable. Advocates of this audacious plan at Imperial General Headquarters were already, with bureaucratic zeal, setting up detailed occupation systems and administrative structures for Australia and even New Zealand, as if their conquest was a mere formality. Yamamoto, however, harbored deep reservations about the Australia plan. He thought it would take far too long to execute. A slow, grinding campaign that would bleed Japan white. More importantly, he feared it would not be spectacular enough, not the kind of single, shocking, war-ending blow that could truly halt the Americans in their tracks. Yamamoto also possessed a profound, almost instinctive understanding of the American character. He knew that the attack on Pearl Harbor, far from cowing the Americans as some in Tokyo believed, had instead aroused a deep, burning spirit of vengeance in a people the Japanese had been taught, and had begun to believe, were soft, decadent, and incompetent. Too soft, the Army generals had sneered, dismissing the idea that America could fight a war to the bitter, bloody finish. It was becoming painfully apparent even to the most ardent nationalists that even the capture of Singapore, a disaster of historic proportions for the British, would not be enough to stop the Americans. Yamamoto needed, a victory so dazzling, so psychologically shattering, that it would make it politically possible, even desirable, for Japan to extend a generous olive branch to offer terms from a position of unassailable strength. In January, driven by this urgent need, Yamamoto ordered his staff to draw up yet another plan. 2 months later in March, he dispatched officers to Tokyo, bearing a document designated the MI Plan. This plan envisaged a decisive carrier versus carrier battle off the tiny, insignificant atoll of Midway Island, where the full might of the American carrier force would be lured out and utterly destroyed. He also sent, almost as an afterthought, the AL Plan, a wildly ambitious document detailing a potential invasion of the North American continent via Alaska. If all went well, according to this fantastical scenario, Hawaii would be occupied, and later perhaps even the west coast of the United States itself. Yamamoto knew these latter ideas were bordering on the delusional, but he calculated that even victories at Midway and in the Aleutians would give the politicians in Tokyo a powerful, tangible base from which to negotiate the sort of favorable, face-saving peace that he desperately hoped to achieve. In Tokyo, the admirals quarreled fiercely, passionately, around the heavy conference table in the Navy Ministry, their voices rising and falling like the tide. But in the end, as always, Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the man whose strategic vision had brought them this far, had his way. His will prevailed. Forgotten, lost in the rush to embrace the Midway gamble, was the potential, world-shaking significance of the fall of Singapore in February and the impending, inevitable collapse of Bataan and Corregidor in the Philippines. Either of these colossal disasters, Yamamoto believed, might have served his purpose just as well, providing the psychological shock needed to force the Allies to the negotiating table. The reason they were suddenly deemed unimportant, cast aside like yesterday's newspaper, lay in a single, shocking event: the April raid by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's squadron of B-25 bombers on the very heart of the Japanese Empire, Tokyo itself. The Doolittle Raid, though it caused minimal physical damage, delivered a profound psychological blow. It shocked the Japanese people and the military leadership into a stark, terrifying realization. The Americans were not broken. They were only just beginning to fight. They had struck back audaciously at the homeland itself. This raid, more than any strategic calculation, pushed Yamamoto and the Navy General Staff toward the desperate gamble of Midway. In June, the Midway operation flared into a catastrophic disaster for Japan. 4 of their precious, irreplaceable fleet carriers, the core of their naval air power, were sent to the bottom of the Pacific in a single afternoon. In the stunned, smoke-filled aftermath, there was no time for recrimination, no luxury of soul-searching. Indeed, the Imperial Japanese Army did not even know the full, horrifying extent of the defeat. The news of the destruction of the 4 big fleet carriers was carefully, deliberately suppressed by the Navy. It was a secret known only at the very highest, most rarefied levels of the Naval Command, a truth too terrible to be shared. While Yamamoto was off on his ill-fated Midway excursion, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, operating almost independently, had been steadily, relentlessly moving the Navy and its land-based air forces southward. Their goal was to set up the forthcoming crucial attempt to cut off Australia, to sever its lifeline to the United States. Naval forces had taken Rabaul on January 23rd, and from that secure, fortified base, they had conducted constant air reconnaissance and bombing raids against other islands and against the northern coast of New Guinea. It was glaringly apparent to the Australians, who communicated their mounting fears to General Douglas MacArthur after his dramatic arrival in March, that the Japanese would soon make their move against Port Moresby in New Guinea. If they succeeded there, it would be, for the Japanese, very nearly a walkover to launch an invasion of northern Australia itself. The Japanese had already signaled their intent, bombing the Australian port of Darwin in February. In March, when they invaded Salamaua on the northeast coast of New Guinea, the pace of their advance quickened dramatically. In May, just before the Midway battle, the Japanese sent a powerful occupation force steaming toward Port Moresby, aiming to seize it by sea. This force, however, was turned back bloodied and battered by the fierce, unexpected defense mounted by American and Australian naval and air forces in the world's first carrier versus carrier battle, the Battle of the Coral Sea. Though a tactical draw, it was a crucial strategic victory for the Allies, halting the Japanese advance on Port Moresby. The Japanese did manage to occupy Tulagi, north of Guadalcanal, and immediately began constructing a seaplane base there. A dagger pointed at the Allied lines of communication. The Battle of the Coral Sea convinced the planners in Washington and in Australia that they could no longer afford to be passive. They had to prepare for the next Japanese move in the south. General MacArthur, ever the strategist, told the anxious Australian government it must be ready for an imminent attack. He believed erroneously, as it turned out, that the next major Japanese thrust would be made against India. He cabled General George C. Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, urgently requesting 2 aircraft carriers and 1,000 planes to bolster the defenses of the Southwest Pacific. In Washington, that same May, Admiral Ernest J. King, the formidable Chief of Naval Operations, informed General Marshall of a harsh, unyielding reality. Until the end of June, he would have only 2 working aircraft carriers available for the entire, vast Pacific theater. On the eve of Midway, the Japanese could boast of 10 operational carriers, while Pacific Fleet Commander Chester W. Nimitz had already, through brilliant code-breaking, given advanced warning of the big Japanese move he expected, a move that turned out to be the Midway operation. While these titanic events were unfolding at Midway, the Japanese were diligently, methodically establishing their forces in the New Guinea Solomons area. Major General Tomitaro Hori landed his South Seas force at Salamaua, and Japanese naval troops occupied Lae, immediately beginning to build up a major air base there. Operating independently of Admiral Yamamoto, who was still reeling from his Midway defeat, the Imperial General Staff had planned the Port Moresby operation and ordered Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake to press on with plans to invade New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. He was to be ready to resume the advance against Port Moresby by July, after the Midway battle, when Admiral Yamamoto and his combined fleet, it was confidently assumed, would have returned victorious, their big carrier force ready to provide protective cover for this new southward thrust. The defeat at Midway, reported to the forces in the field as a great victory, did not alter the Imperial General Headquarters' ambitious plans one iota. A few days after the disaster at Midway, the Australians informed General MacArthur that the Japanese were poised to move again. Buoyed by the false news of a Midway victory, MacArthur, ever the opportunist, suggested that the Allies launch a preemptive attack on the New Britain-New Ireland area, culminating in a full-scale assault on Rabaul, the main Japanese naval and air base in the region. With the 2 carriers, the 1,000 planes, and an amphibious division he had requested, MacArthur believed he could force the Japanese back, all the way back to Truk, their great Central Pacific bastion. On June 12, General Marshall, intrigued by MacArthur's bold plan, presented it to Admiral King, albeit with some modifications. He wanted 3 carriers instead of 2, and 1 Marine division plus 3 Army divisions to make the assaults. Admiral King, however, opposed the idea vehemently. His primary reason was command. He did not want MacArthur, an Army general, commanding naval forces and naval operations. His other reasons, while valid, were supplementary. The carriers, he argued, would be dangerously exposed to land-based Japanese air attack from Rabaul and would not have sufficient air cover or protection. As it turned out, the Navy would have to grapple with both of these tactical nightmares head-on during the upcoming campaign for Guadalcanal. King devised his own plan: a drive northward from the New Hebrides, conducted by forces firmly under Navy command. MacArthur, predictably, objected to having his precious Army forces serve under Navy command, but nobody, not even the proud general, could deny the absolute burning necessity of stopping the Japanese before they consolidated their hold on New Guinea and positioned themselves for a direct assault on Australia. The problem for the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff now became one of command. Who would lead this crucial, potentially war-winning operation? They devised a compromise. Phase 1. The primary task of taking the Santa Cruz Islands, Tulagi, and adjacent positions was given to Admiral King and the Navy. Guadalcanal, at that moment, was just a speck on the map, an insignificant dot with no known tactical or strategic value. It did not even merit a specific name in this initial JCS plan. General MacArthur was thrown a bone. After Phase 1 was complete, he would take over and mop up the Japanese in the rest of the Solomons, Rabaul, and New Guinea. Admiral King was given his way because the Joint Chiefs recognized that King had already, with characteristic foresight, planned a defensive line stretching down the Pacific to protect Australia. His plan, they calculated, would require relatively fewer forces than MacArthur's grand, sweeping offensive. Thousands of troops were already training in New Caledonia, and King had successfully wheedled General Henry Hap Arnold into sending several squadrons of U.S. Army Air Force planes to reinforce the islands. He had bolstered the defenses of Samoa and Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides, and planned to establish a new base in Tonga. Admiral Wilson Brown, whose perceived indecisiveness during the Wake Island crisis had deeply annoyed Admiral King, was unceremoniously shipped off to a newly established backwater unit called the Amphibious Training Command at San Diego. He, along with Marine Major General Holland Smith, was tasked with developing new, desperately needed techniques for modern island warfare. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, King's brilliant, if abrasive, chief of plans, suggested a phased approach. The first effort, he argued, must be to hold the precarious line in the South Pacific while frantically training the raw, untested amphibious forces. The second stage would be a combined offensive, a hammer blow delivered by the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, driving through the Solomon Islands to the Bismarck Archipelago and the Admiralty Islands. The third stage would involve the seizure of the Caroline and Marshall Islands, and the fourth and final stage would take the Allies either to the oil-rich Dutch East Indies or back to the Philippines, MacArthur's cherished goal. Admiral King approved this plan instantly. It was, in essence, the plan he himself had envisioned. He immediately made arrangements to bring Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, who was serving as a naval observer in London, back to take command of the entire South Pacific operation. King detached Rear Admiral Turner from the Plans Division and told him bluntly to get ready to take over as commander of the amphibious invasion force. All this frantic planning and preparation was done even before the Japanese launched their assault on Port Moresby and Tulagi. Vice Admiral Gormley left Washington on May 1st. He would formally take command of the South Pacific Force on June 19th, but first he had to travel to Pearl Harbor to report to Admiral Nimitz, who would be his direct superior. By the time Gormley arrived at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese offensive in the South Pacific was already gathering momentum. On May 22nd, an American Army reconnaissance plane spotted a Japanese photo-reconnaissance aircraft methodically taking pictures of Guadalcanal. Army intelligence analysts studying the grainy photos suggested that the Japanese were preparing to build an airfield there. On June 25th, Army intelligence reported that the tall, tough kunai grass on the island's central plain had been deliberately burned off, and that rows of tents had sprung up in the area. A wharf was under frantic construction at Lunga Point. 6 days later, on July 1st, an Australian coast watcher, hidden in the dense jungle of Guadalcanal, sent a chilling report. Construction of the airfield was complete and operational, awaiting only the arrival of Japanese aircraft. He even knew the names of the construction units: the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces, the Japanese equivalent of American CB units. This alarming intelligence was swiftly confirmed by a radio interception made by Nimitz's codebreakers at Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet's Radio Intelligence Group, which had painstakingly broken parts of the complex Japanese naval code, picked up a message stating clearly that the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces would arrive at their destination on July 4th. Fleet intelligence officers, putting two and two together, realized with dawning horror what was happening. Admiral Turner, who happened to be visiting Pearl Harbor that very day on his way to prepare for the amphibious landing somewhere in the South Pacific, was immediately summoned. When Admiral Nimitz showed him the decrypted radio intelligence report, Turner, a man of decisive action, knew instantly where he was going. It could be no place but the Solomons, and the target could be no place but Guadalcanal. Within 2 weeks, Turner was in Wellington, New Zealand, where he boarded his flagship, the USS Macaulay, a former Grace Line passenger ship hastily converted for war. His Herculean task was to train an entire, untested amphibious task force to turn a collection of ships and men into a cohesive, effective fighting force in just 1 month. As Turner began the frantic, chaotic process of moving ships and men into position, Admiral Gormley was on his way to Melbourne to confer with the formidable General MacArthur. Gormley left New Zealand with his head full of gloomy, pessimistic thoughts about the sheer, almost suicidal foolishness of trying to stage a complex amphibious operation when nobody, not the Navy, not the Marines, not the Army, truly knew how to do it properly. MacArthur, who had his own deep-seated reasons for disliking the Navy's plan and resenting King's dominance, agreed with Gormley entirely. They also concurred, with grim certainty, that with the limited number of aircraft currently at their disposal, they could not possibly guarantee the landing force the air cover it would desperately need to survive. After all, this crucial meeting occurred on July 18th, and the landings were scheduled for just 3 weeks later, on August 7th. They hastily drafted a dispatch back to Washington, urgently recommending that the entire operation be postponed, delayed until they were truly ready. But Admiral King, the indomitable, relentless driving force behind the entire Pacific strategy, was not happy with that message. He had told his new commander, Gormley, in no uncertain terms, that he was handing him a difficult, almost impossible job, and that he, King, would not be able to provide Gormley with the proper tools, sufficient ships, planes, and trained men, until perhaps the fall. King's answer to Gormley's plea for delay was a single emphatic word: no. The invasion would proceed as planned, come hell or high water. Now Gormley, who had left Washington already convinced that the United States was woefully unprepared for aggressive action in the South Pacific, felt his gloom deepen into a profound sense of dread when he tried, and failed utterly, to get CB units and other vital construction troops sent immediately to New Zealand. From the very beginning, the Guadalcanal invasion plan was plagued, haunted, by catastrophic failures of intelligence. All the concerned commands knew that some sort of operation was imminent, particularly after July 10th, when Admiral Nimitz sent Admiral Gormley his formal operations orders. Everyone understood that the major Japanese airbase at Rabaul, with its hundreds of aircraft, posed an existential threat. Planes from Rabaul could easily stage through Guadalcanal, refuel, and then bomb Australia itself. There was no doubt they could strike a deadly, crippling blow at the fragile Allied buildup in the South Pacific. Yet on July 10th, the Allied intelligence summaries reaching Admiral King in Washington contained only a casual, almost dismissive comment about airfield construction at Guadalcanal. A few days later, another report even managed to locate the nearly completed airfield on the wrong side of the island. By the end of July, the Japanese had finished the airfield. Back at Combined Fleet headquarters in Japan, Admiral Yamamoto, still licking his wounds from Midway but ever the strategist, gave orders that the first staged bombing mission would leave Rabaul on August 14th, using the new Guadalcanal airfield as a forward base. As commander of the overall United States operation, Admiral Gormley tried desperately, frantically to get more help, to build advanced bases, to bring in more planes, to gather more supplies. But everywhere he turned, he encountered the harsh, unyielding truth of Admiral King's earlier assertion. He would not be given the proper tools. The supplies for the invasion forces, for example, were loaded in a chaotic, haphazard hodgepodge aboard the transports at Oakland, California. There were plenty of docks available, which would have allowed the ships to be unloaded and then meticulously reloaded with supplies in the precise order of their intended use on the beach. Instead, the ships were sent directly to Noumea in New Caledonia, which had no such sophisticated unloading and reloading facilities. The result was predictable chaos. Admiral King had at least a general, if grim, idea of the logistical difficulties, but there was simply no time for delay, no time for perfection. King knew, better than any of his subordinates, the absolute, non-negotiable necessity of stopping the Japanese juggernaut before it reached the shores of Australia. The timetable, therefore, remained immovable, carved in stone. By late July, the rush was on, a desperate, headlong sprint to the starting line. Some 16,000 Marines, not 177,000, which is a clear error in the original text, were moving by troop ship from California, from Pearl Harbor, from Noumea, and from Samoa, converging on the rendezvous point. Admiral Gormley was too overwhelmed, too buried in paperwork and logistical nightmares to hold a proper conference of his key commanders. But on July 28th, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who was slated to be in overall tactical command of the naval forces protecting the invasion, finally called a meeting aboard his flagship, the carrier USS Saratoga. It was the first time the commanders of the various tactical units, the carrier groups, the amphibious force, the Marines, had ever met face-to-face to discuss the invasion. Admiral Fletcher was to protect the invasion with his precious carrier task force. Admiral Turner was to deliver the troops of Marine General Alexander A. Vandegrift to the beaches. Once the Marines had secured the island, garrison troops would be brought in to hold it. But so hastily had this operation been conceived and launched that no one had made any provision for reserve troops. There were simply no more men available anywhere in the South Pacific. The meeting on the Saratoga was tense, fraught with underlying anxiety and disagreement. Fletcher began by dropping a bombshell. He announced with cold finality that he would protect the landings at Guadalcanal for only 2 days. He insisted, and Gormley's own staff members at the meeting, perhaps out of fear or deference, concurred, that the irreplaceable aircraft carriers must not be risked. They were too valuable, too vulnerable. Fletcher, burned by his experiences and perhaps still shaken by Midway, was gun-shy. He thought the whole operation was cockeyed, hasty, poorly planned, and ultimately doomed to failure. Admiral Turner, who possessed a far better, more comprehensive understanding of the global military picture than any other man in that crowded cabin, chided his superior. "There is no point in that sort of argument," Turner said, his voice tight with controlled frustration. "The decision has been made. We are going to risk everything. It is our job, our duty, to carry out our orders." Fletcher, of course, ought to have known all this. After the Battle of the Coral Sea, Admiral King had been so displeased with Fletcher's perceived caution, his constant avoidance of decisive action, that he had insisted Admiral Nimitz personally ascertain the condition of Fletcher's fighting spirit. Nimitz, a kindly, fatherly figure who genuinely liked Fletcher, had given the carrier commander a much-needed pep talk. Then, when Fletcher had performed well, even heroically, in the subsequent victory at Midway, he could hardly be faulted. But now, on the very eve of America's first major offensive operation of the war, to warn the troops and the men of the support ships that he was going to abandon them, to pull his carriers out to sea after a mere 48 hours was a most inauspicious indeed, a potentially disastrous beginning. The rehearsal for the Guadalcanal invasion, staged on July 28th near the Fiji Islands, lasted 3 days and was, by any measure, a complete and utter fiasco. Only a third of the assigned troops managed to get ashore, and when they did, they were confused, disorganized, and didn't know what to do. General Vandegrift, watching the chaotic spectacle unfold, regarded the mock-up as a complete bust, a terrifying preview of the disaster to come. But there was no time, not even for second-guessing or remedial training. On July 31st, the chastened, anxious Marines were herded back aboard their transports and set sail for Guadalcanal.